At my wife's funeral, my daughter screamed at me, "You should have died in her place, you useless old man." When I got into the car to leave, she pushed me out and said, "Go live on the street." But when she arrived home, she was shocked by who was sitting on the couch. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. My name is Thomas, and I'm 64 years old. I never imagined that the worst day of my life wouldn't be losing my wife of 30 years. But what happened at her funeral? The morning of Margaret's service, I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my black tie with trembling fingers. My reflection looked back at me, gray hair thinning at the crown, deep lines etched around my eyes from 3 decades of trying to please a woman who never seemed satisfied, and shoulders that had carried more disappointment than any man should bear. I had practiced what I would say about Margaret, how I would honor her memory in front of our daughter Sarah and the handful of neighbors who would attend. I drove to Peaceful Rest Funeral Home in the old Honda Margaret always complained about. "Why can't you drive something decent, Thomas?" she'd say whenever we pulled up anywhere. "What will people think?" I pulled into the parking lot, my hands shaking slightly as I turned off the engine. Inside, the familiar smell of lilies and wood polish filled my nostrils as I walked toward the casket, where my wife of 30 years lay. Margaret looked peaceful, finally. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. She wore the navy blue dress she'd bought for our anniversary last year, the anniversary where she'd spent the entire dinner pointing out everything I'd done wrong that week. But looking at her now, I tried to remember the woman I'd fallen in love with, the one who'd smiled at me across a crowded diner in 1994, and made me believe I could be someone worth loving. Sarah arrived 20 minutes late, her heels clicking sharply against the funeral home's hardwood floors. At 35, she was the spitting image of her mother, same sharp cheekbones, same piercing blue eyes, same expression of perpetual disappointment when she looked at me. She wore an expensive black suit that probably cost more than my monthly pension, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun that made her look older than her years. "Dad," she said, her voice flat and cold as she walked past me to the casket. She didn't hug me, didn't offer any comfort. She simply stood there staring down at her mother, and I could see her jaw tightening with some emotion I couldn't quite read. The service was small and somber. Pastor Williams spoke about Margaret's dedication to the church, her volunteer work with the Women's Auxiliary, her devotion to her family. I sat in the front row, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life, even with Sarah sitting rigid beside me. When it came time for family to speak, Sarah stood up without warning. "My mother was the strongest woman I knew," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the small chapel. "She worked 2 jobs to keep food on our table when I was growing up. She never complained, never asked for help, never expected anyone else to carry her weight." Her eyes found mine across the room, and there was something cold and accusatory in her gaze. She deserved better than she got. The words hit me like physical blows. I felt my face flush with shame and confusion. Margaret had worked, yes, but I'd been the primary breadwinner for most of our marriage. I'd worked construction for 25 years, my hands bleeding and my back aching, to provide for our family. But somehow, in Sarah's version of our family story, I was invisible. After the burial, as people were heading to their cars, Sarah grabbed my arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong. "We need to talk," she said, pulling me aside near a large oak tree that cast shadows across the freshly turned earth of her mother's grave. "Sarah, I know this is hard," I started, but she cut me off. "Hard?" Her voice was rising, and I could see other mourners turning to look. "You want to know what's hard, Dad? Hard is watching your mother work herself to death while her husband sits around feeling sorry for himself." "That's not fair," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I worked every day to provide for—" "Provide what?" she snapped. "A life of struggle, a house that was always falling apart. Mom told me how you never helped with anything, how she had to manage everything alone while you just existed." I felt something breaking inside my chest. This wasn't grief talking. This was years of accumulated resentment, carefully cultivated and nurtured. "Sarah, your mother and I, we had our problems, but I loved her. I loved both of you. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Love? You call what you gave us love? Mom used to cry herself to sleep because she was so tired, so overwhelmed. And where were you? Watching TV, reading your newspapers, being useless. The words felt like they were coming from far away, like I was watching this happen to someone else. This was my daughter, the little girl I'd taught to ride a bike, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose bedtime stories I'd read for years. But looking at her now, I saw only Margaret's cold disapproval reflected in her eyes. Mom always said you were weak, Sarah continued, her voice getting louder. She said she should have left you years ago, but she stayed because someone had to take care of you. Someone had to make sure you didn't fall completely apart. Sarah, please. I reached out to touch her arm, but she jerked away like my touch burned her. You should have died instead of her, she said, and the words hung in the air like a curse. Several people nearby had stopped talking and were staring at us now. You're 64 years old, and you've never done anything meaningful with your life. Mom was only 59. She had so much more to give, so much more to live for, but instead, we lost her, and we're stuck with you. I felt my knees go weak. People were staring, whispering, and I could see the judgment in their eyes. Some looked shocked by Sarah's outburst, but others nodded slightly as if they'd always suspected I wasn't worthy of Margaret. Get in the car, Sarah said, walking toward the black sedan she'd rented for the day. We're going home. I followed her on unsteady legs, climbing into the passenger seat like an obedient child. The ride home was silent, except for Sarah's angry breathing and the sound of the radio playing soft classical music that felt grotesquely inappropriate. When we pulled into the driveway of the house Margaret and I had shared for 15 years, Sarah didn't turn off the engine. Instead, she turned to me with eyes that held no warmth, no love, no recognition of the 35 years I'd spent trying to be her father. Get out, she said. What? Get out of the car and get out of the house. You're not welcome here anymore. I stared at her, certain I'd misheard. Sarah, this is my home. Your mother and I... Mom left the house to me, she interrupted. She changed the will 6 months ago. She knew you couldn't take care of yourself, let alone a house. She knew I was the only one responsible enough to handle her affairs. The world seemed to tilt sideways. She never told me. Why would she? You would have just made it harder for her, just like you made everything harder. Sarah reached across me and opened the passenger door. Get out, Dad. Go find somewhere else to be a burden. I'm done. I climbed out of the car slowly, my body feeling ancient and brittle. As I stood in the driveway, Sarah leaned out the window one final time. And don't think about coming back. Mom always said you were pathetic, and now I can see she was right. I never want to see you again. She drove off, leaving me standing there in my funeral suit, watching the car disappear around the corner. The house I'd helped pay for, the home where I'd lived for 15 years, suddenly felt like a stranger's property. I reached for my keys but realized Sarah was right. If Margaret had changed the will, if the house was really Sarah's now, I had no legal right to be there. I stood there for what felt like hours, watching the sun begin to set behind the house that was no longer mine, wondering how everything I thought I knew about my life had been a lie. 3 days after Margaret's funeral, I found myself sitting on a narrow cot in the Sunrise Men's Shelter, staring at the few possessions I'd managed to salvage from my old life. A small suitcase with some clothes, my reading glasses, a photo of Sarah from her high school graduation, and my worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, the only book Margaret had ever let me keep in the living room because it looked respectable. The shelter was a harsh awakening. The walls were painted an institutional green that made everything look sickly, and the air smelled of disinfectant mixed with the unwashed bodies of men who'd lost everything. I wasn't like them, I kept telling myself. I had worked my whole life, paid my taxes, been a good husband and father. This was just temporary, just until I figured out my next move. But lying there at night, listening to the sounds of grown men crying in their sleep, I began to replay every conversation, every moment from my marriage, searching for clues I'd missed. How had I become the villain in my own family's story? I remembered when Sarah was 12 and had broken Margaret's favorite vase while playing ball in the house. Margaret had been furious, her face red with anger, as she demanded to know who was responsible. Sarah had looked terrified, and without thinking, I'd stepped forward. "It was me," I'd said. "I knocked it over while dusting." Margaret had turned her cold gaze on me. "Of course it was. You're so clumsy, Thomas. Can't you be more careful with my things?" Sarah had watched the entire exchange, and I'd seen something shift in her eyes. Relief that she wasn't in trouble, but also something else. A confirmation that Dad was indeed the one who broke things, who caused problems, who made Mom unhappy. Now, lying on that shelter cot, I realized that had been the first of many times Margaret had used me as a scapegoat. When Sarah's grades slipped in 8th grade, Margaret told her it was because I was too lenient and didn't help with homework. The truth was, I'd spent hours every night sitting at the kitchen table with Sarah, helping her with math and history. But Margaret would tell Sarah the next day that she was the only one who cared about her education. When Sarah was 16 and wanted to go to an expensive summer camp, Margaret had sighed dramatically at the dinner table. "I wish we could afford it, sweetheart, but your father's job just doesn't pay enough. If he were more ambitious, more successful, maybe we could give you the opportunities you deserve." I'd worked double shifts for 3 months to pay for that camp, my body aching and my hands raw from extra construction work. But when Sarah left for camp, glowing with excitement, she'd hugged Margaret goodbye and barely acknowledged me. Margaret had made sure Sarah knew who the real provider was, who had sacrificed to make her dreams possible. The pattern had continued for years. When Sarah graduated high school as valedictorian, Margaret had taken full credit for pushing her to succeed, despite the lack of support at home. When Sarah got accepted to college, Margaret told everyone how hard it had been to raise an ambitious daughter without a partner who shared her values. I'd thought I was being a good husband by not contradicting Margaret, by letting her have her moments in the spotlight. I'd thought I was protecting Sarah from seeing conflict between her parents. But Margaret had been systematically erasing me from our family narrative, painting herself as the long-suffering single mother and me as the dead weight she was too noble to abandon. The worst part was how subtle it had been. Margaret never outright lied. She just emphasized certain truths and ignored others. She'd mention how tired she was from working, but never mention that I worked construction 10 hours a day. She'd talk about paying for Sarah's school supplies, but not mention that the money came from my paycheck. She'd praise Sarah's accomplishments as a result of her guidance, conveniently forgetting the countless hours I'd spent helping with projects and driving to activities. On my 5th night in the shelter, I called Sarah from the payphone in the lobby. My hands were shaking as I dialed the number, but I needed to try to explain, to make her understand that her mother had manipulated both of us. "Hello." Sarah's voice was cold when she realized it was me. "Sarah, please don't hang up. I just want to talk." "I have nothing to say to you, Dad. Mom warned me you'd try to guilt me into letting you back in." "Warned you?" "Sarah, your mother died 6 days ago." "When could she have warned you about anything?" There was a pause, and for a moment I thought she might listen. But then her voice came back, harder than before. "She warned me months ago. She said if anything happened to her, you'd try to manipulate me with sob stories about how hard your life was, how much you'd sacrificed. She said you'd never take responsibility for being a failure." A failure? The word hit me like a physical blow. "Sarah, I worked construction for 25 years to provide for our family. I never missed a day of work, never complained about the long hours or the physical pain. How is that failure?" "Mom said you were in denial about your limitations. She said you'd probably end up homeless without her to manage your life, and that I shouldn't feel guilty about it because some people just can't take care of themselves." I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles white. Margaret had planned this. Even from the grave, she was controlling the narrative, controlling Sarah's perception of me. "Your mother? She told you I'd end up homeless? She said you'd probably guilt me into letting you live in the house, but that I shouldn't enable your dependence. She made me promise that when she died, I'd finally force you to grow up and take responsibility for your own life." The cruelty of it took my breath away. Margaret hadn't just been undermining me for years. She'd been preparing Sarah to abandon me completely. She'd planted the idea that throwing me out was actually helping me, that leaving me with nothing was an act of tough love. "Sarah, I'm living in a homeless shelter," I said quietly. "I'm 64 years old and I have nowhere to go. Is this really what you think I deserve?" "I think you deserve whatever consequences come from a lifetime of not trying hard enough," she said, and I could hear Margaret's voice in every word. "I have to go, Dad. I have a life to build, and Mom taught me not to let other people's problems become mine." The line went dead, and I stood there holding the phone, listening to the dial tone until someone else needed to make a call. That night, lying in my narrow cot, I finally understood the full scope of what Margaret had done. She hadn't just turned Sarah against me. She convinced Sarah that abandoning me was actually a kindness, that I was so fundamentally flawed that the only way I could grow was through complete rejection. But what Margaret hadn't counted on was how much I'd learned about survival during my years in construction. I'd worked through broken bones and ice storms and equipment failures. I'd found ways to solve problems that seemed impossible. And now, at 64, stripped of everything I thought defined me, I was about to discover just how much strength I had left. 2 weeks after Margaret's funeral, while I was learning to navigate life in the shelter, Sarah was having what she thought would be a quiet evening at home. She told me later, during one of our difficult conversations, exactly how it happened. How she'd walked through the front door of the house that had been our home for 15 years, expecting the familiar emptiness of grief, only to find her supposedly dead mother sitting calmly on the living room sofa. "Hello, sweetheart," Margaret had said, as casually as if she'd been waiting for Sarah to come home from work. "We need to talk." Sarah had dropped her purse, her keys clattering to the floor. She'd stood there, frozen in the doorway, staring at the woman she'd buried 2 weeks ago. Margaret looked exactly the same perfectly styled silver hair, same navy blue dress she'd been buried in, same cold, calculating eyes. "Mom?" Sarah's voice had come out as a whisper. "But how are you?" Margaret had smiled then, but it wasn't the warm smile of a mother reuniting with her daughter. It was the satisfied smile of someone whose elaborate plan had worked perfectly. "I'm very much alive, as you can see. Please, sit down. You look pale." Sarah had stumbled to the armchair across from the couch, never taking her eyes off her mother. "I don't understand. The funeral. The casket. I saw your body." "You saw what I wanted you to see," Margaret had said matter-of-factly. "It's amazing what funeral makeup and a sedative can accomplish. Mrs. Henderson from the funeral home has been a dear friend for years. She owed me a favor." "A favor?" Sarah's voice was getting higher, more panicked. "Mom, what are you talking about? I grieved for you. I buried you. I threw Dad out of his own house because I thought you were dead." Margaret's expression had hardened slightly. "Yes, I know. I watched the funeral from the basement of the funeral home. Quite touching, really. Though I was disappointed in your father's eulogy. So brief, so lacking in emotion. Even at my supposed death, he couldn't be bothered to put in much effort." Sarah had gripped the arms of her chair, her knuckles white. "Why would you do this? Why would you put me through that kind of pain?" Margaret had leaned forward, her eyes fixed on her daughter's face. "Because I needed to know, Sarah. I needed to know if you really loved me, or if you were just waiting for me to die so you could inherit everything." "That's horrible. Of course I love you. You're my mother." "Are you sure about that?" Margaret's voice had taken on a sharp edge. "Because love isn't just words, sweetheart. Love is action. Love is loyalty. And I needed to see where your loyalties really lay." Sarah had felt something cold settle in her stomach. There was something different about her mother, something harder and more calculating than she'd ever seen before. "I needed to see if you would choose me over your father," Margaret had continued, "if you would protect my memory, honor what I taught you about the kind of man he really is. And you did beautifully, dear. The way you threw him out, the things you said to him at the funeral, I was so proud. You heard what I said to Dad? Every word. You should have died instead of her. That took real strength, Sarah. That showed me you finally understand what I've been trying to teach you all these years." Sarah had felt sick. The memory of her father's face when she'd said those words came flooding back. The way he'd looked like she'd physically struck him, the way his shoulders had sagged as if she'd broken something inside him. But why did you have to test me like this? Why couldn't you just trust that I loved you? Margaret had stood up then, smoothing her dress with the same precise movements Sarah remembered from childhood. Because trust without proof is just naive hope, sweetheart. I've spent 30 years married to a man who made grand declarations about love and loyalty, but when it came time to actually prove it, he always fell short. Dad loves you, Mom. He's been devastated. Your father, Margaret had interrupted, her voice sharp as glass, loves the idea of being married. He loves having someone to cook his meals and manage his life and make him feel important. But he's never loved me. Not really. If he had, he would have fought harder to be the kind of husband I deserved. Sarah had stared at her mother, seeing something in her face she'd never noticed before, a coldness that went deeper than disappointment, deeper than frustration. It was contempt, pure and undiluted. I don't understand what you want from me, Sarah had said quietly. Margaret had smiled again, and this time there was something almost predatory in it. I want you to understand that everything I've done has been to protect you from making the same mistakes I did. I want you to see that weak people will drag you down if you let them, and that includes your father. He's not weak, Mom. He worked hard his whole life to provide for us. He did the bare minimum, Margaret had snapped. Any man can show up to a job and swing a hammer. That doesn't make him special. A real man would have been ambitious. A real man would have found a way to give his family more than just survival. Sarah had felt something shifting inside her chest, a growing discomfort with the conversation. Dad always seemed to love us. He was always there when I needed him. He was physically present, Margaret had corrected. That's not the same thing as being a real father. A real father would have pushed you harder, expected more from you, prepared you for the real world instead of just reading you bedtime stories and helping with homework. But those things mattered to me. Those memories are sentimental nonsense, Margaret had interrupted. I'm the one who made sure you had discipline, who pushed you to excel in school, who taught you to expect better than what your father could provide. Without me, you would have been just another mediocre person, content with mediocrity. Sarah had felt her head spinning. This wasn't how she remembered her childhood. Yes, her mother had been the disciplinarian, but her father had been the one who made her feel loved, who celebrated her successes, who comforted her when she failed. Mom, I think maybe being dead or pretending to be dead has affected your thinking. You're saying things that don't sound like you. Margaret had laughed then, but it was harsh and bitter. This is exactly like me, sweetheart. This is who I've always been. You've just never seen it clearly because I've spent 30 years protecting you from the truth about what weakness looks like. What truth? That your father is a burden, that he always has been, that I've carried him for 3 decades, and now it's time for both of us to be free of him. Sarah had stood up abruptly, her legs unsteady. Mom, you're talking about Dad like he's not even human. I'm talking about him like he's exactly what he is. A man who never lived up to his potential and expects everyone else to compensate for his failures. Margaret's voice had been calm, matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather. I've done my duty as his wife. I've covered for him, made excuses for him, protected him from the consequences of his own inadequacy. But I'm 59 years old, Sarah, and I'm tired of pretending that mediocrity deserves my devotion. 59? Mom, you're dead. You're supposed to be dead. Margaret had waved her hand dismissively. I'm very much alive, and I intend to stay that way. But I needed to see if you were strong enough to stand with me, or if you were going to let sentiment about your father cloud your judgment. Sarah had sunk back into the chair, her mind reeling. I threw him out of his home. I told him I never wanted to see him again. If you're alive, then I destroyed my relationship with Dad for nothing. Not for nothing, Margaret had said firmly. For me, for us, for the life we can build together without having to constantly manage his neediness. Sarah had looked up at her mother, and for the first time in her life, she'd seen Margaret clearly. Not as the long-suffering saint she'd always believed her to be, but as something much colder and more calculating. Where has he been living? Sarah had asked quietly. I assume wherever useless men end up, when they can't take care of themselves, Margaret had replied with a shrug. That's not our problem anymore. And that's when Sarah had realized that the woman sitting across from her wasn't the mother she'd thought she knew at all. Sarah had spent the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling of what had been her parents' bedroom, trying to process the impossible reality that her mother was alive and sitting in the living room below. When morning came, she'd found Margaret in the kitchen, calmly making coffee as if the previous evening's revelation had been perfectly normal. "Good morning, sweetheart," Margaret had said without looking up. "I hope you slept well." Sarah had stood in the doorway, studying her mother's profile. In the harsh morning light, she could see things she'd missed the night before. A hardness around Margaret's eyes, a tension in her jaw that spoke of years of carefully controlled anger. "Mom, we need to talk about what you've done." Margaret had poured herself a cup of coffee, then settled at the kitchen table with the newspaper, as if this were any other morning. "We talked last night, dear. I explained everything quite clearly. You explained that you faked your own death to test my loyalty. You explained that you wanted me to throw Dad out of his home, but you didn't explain why you hate him so much." Margaret's hand had stilled on her coffee cup. Hate is such a strong word. "Then what would you call it?" Margaret had set down the newspaper and looked directly at Sarah for the first time that morning. "I would call it clarity. I would call it finally being honest about what 30 years of marriage to a weak man does to a woman." Sarah had pulled out the chair across from her mother and sat down. "Tell me about the weakness. Tell me exactly what Dad did that was so terrible." Margaret's eyes had lit up with something that looked almost like pleasure. "Where should I start? Should I tell you about how he never once in 30 years suggested we take a real vacation? How I had to plan every trip, book every hotel, make every decision because he was too passive to have an opinion about anything?" "That doesn't sound like weakness, Mom. That sounds like he trusted your judgment." "It sounds like he was too lazy to take responsibility," Margaret had snapped. "Should I tell you about how he never once bought me a piece of jewelry without me having to drop hints for months? How I had to practically write him a script for every romantic gesture?" Sarah had frowned. "But he did buy you jewelry, I remember." After I showed him magazine pictures and left catalogs open to specific pages and made comments about what other women's husbands bought them. "That's not romance, Sarah. That's following instructions." Sarah had felt a growing unease. Her mother was describing normal married life as if it were some kind of betrayal. "Mom, maybe Dad just wasn't naturally romantic, but that doesn't mean—" "Should I tell you about how he embarrassed me at every social function we ever attended?" Margaret had continued, her voice getting sharper. "How he would stand in the corner, looking uncomfortable, instead of networking, instead of making connections that could advance our family's position in the community." "Dad's shy, Mom. He's always been shy." "Shy is just another word for selfish," Margaret had said coldly. "He was more concerned with his own comfort than with helping me build the kind of social standing I deserved." Sarah had stared at her mother, beginning to understand something that made her stomach turn. "What kind of social standing did you deserve?" "Better than what I got," Margaret had said immediately. "I was the smartest woman in my graduating class. I could have married a lawyer, a doctor, someone with real ambition. Instead, I married a construction worker who was satisfied with mediocrity." "You married Dad because you loved him." Margaret had laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "I married your father because I was young and stupid, and I thought I could change him. I thought if I loved him enough, supported him enough, pushed him enough, he would become the kind of man I actually wanted to be married to." Sarah had felt something cold settle in her chest, and when he didn't change, I realized I had wasted the best years of my life on someone who would never be worthy of the sacrifice. The words had hung in the air between them, ugly and final. Sarah had gripped her coffee cup tighter, her knuckles white. "Mom, that's horrible. What's horrible is spending 30 years pretending to be happy with someone who never earned your respect," Margaret had replied matter-of-factly. "What's horrible is watching other women my age travel to Europe and drive nice cars and live in beautiful homes while I'm stuck in this mediocre life because I married a mediocre man." Sarah had felt tears burning her eyes. "Dad worked hard. He provided for us. He was a good father. He was adequate, Margaret had corrected, and adequate isn't good enough, not for me, and not for you. What do you mean, not for me? Margaret had leaned forward, her eyes intense. I mean, I spent 30 years making sure you didn't make the same mistakes I did. I made sure you understood that settling for less than you deserve is a choice, and it's the wrong choice. By turning me against Dad, by showing you what weakness looks like so you'd recognize it and reject it. Margaret's voice had been calm, as if she were explaining something simple to a child. Every time your father disappointed me, I made sure you saw it. Every time he failed to step up, I made sure you understood that this wasn't what a real man looked like. Sarah had felt sick. You manipulated me. I educated you, Margaret had corrected. I made sure that when the time came for you to choose between loyalty to weakness and loyalty to strength, you would choose correctly. And the test? Faking your death? Margaret had smiled then, and it was the most chilling expression Sarah had ever seen on her mother's face. I needed to know if my lessons had taken hold. I needed to know if you would stand by me when it really mattered, or if you would let sentimental attachment to your father override your better judgment. By making me destroy my relationship with him. By making you choose, Margaret had said firmly, and you chose me. You chose strength over weakness, standards over settling, your future over the past. Sarah had stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Where is he now? I assume wherever failed men end up when they can't manipulate women into taking care of them anymore. Mom, he's 64 years old. He has nowhere to go. Margaret had shrugged. That's not my problem anymore, and it's not yours either, unless you're planning to make the same mistakes I did. Sarah had stared at her mother, seeing her clearly for the first time in her life. This wasn't love. This wasn't protection. This was cruelty, pure and calculated. I need to find him, Sarah had said quietly. Margaret's expression had changed instantly, becoming sharp and dangerous. Excuse me? I need to find Dad and apologize. You need to do nothing of the sort, Margaret had interrupted, her voice like ice. I didn't spend 30 years protecting you from his weakness just to watch you throw yourself away on misplaced guilt. It's not misplaced. I said terrible things to him. I threw him out of his own home. You did what needed to be done. I did what you manipulated me into doing, Sarah had shot back, her own anger finally rising. You spent my entire childhood programming me to see Dad as a failure, and then you tested whether your programming worked by faking your own death. Margaret had stood up, her face flushed with anger. Don't you dare turn this around on me. Everything I did was to protect you from making the same mistakes. What mistakes? Sarah had exploded. Loving someone who wasn't perfect? Accepting that happiness doesn't always look like a magazine ad? Dad loved us, Mom. He may not have been ambitious or social or romantic in the way you wanted, but he loved us. Love isn't enough, Margaret had said coldly. It should have been, Sarah had replied, and for the first time in her life, she'd seen something like fear flicker in her mother's eyes. Margaret had walked to the window, her back to Sarah. When she spoke again, her voice was different, older, more brittle. Your father never fought for me, she'd said quietly. In 30 years of marriage, he never once fought for me. When I was disappointed, he would just accept it. When I was unhappy, he would just endure it. He never demanded to know what he could do better, never insisted that I tell him how to make me happy. He just accepted that I was miserable and hoped it would somehow get better on its own. Sarah had felt something shift in her understanding. Maybe he was afraid to fight with you. Maybe he thought accepting your unhappiness was better than risking making it worse. Margaret had turned around, and Sarah had seen tears in her mother's eyes for the first time she could remember. Or maybe he just didn't care enough to try, Margaret had whispered. And in that moment, Sarah had finally understood. Her mother hadn't been protecting her from her father's weakness. She'd been punishing him for not being able to fix something that was broken long before he even tried. It had been 3 weeks since Margaret revealed herself to be alive, and Sarah had spent every one of those days searching for me. She'd called every homeless shelter in the city, visited every soup kitchen, driven through every neighborhood where she thought I might be staying. The guilt was eating her alive, she told me later, because she'd finally understood the full scope of what her mother had done to both of us. I was sitting in the common area of Sunrise Men's Shelter, playing checkers with Jerry, a former mechanic who'd lost everything when his wife left him, when Sarah finally found me. I looked up to see her standing in the doorway, her expensive clothes and perfect makeup looking completely out of place among the men who'd gathered there for their evening meal. For a moment, neither of us moved. I studied her face, looking for some sign of the daughter I'd once known, the little girl who used to fall asleep in my lap while I read her bedtime stories. But all I could see was Margaret's eyes staring back at me, filled with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. Dad?" Her voice was softer than I'd heard it in years, almost uncertain. I stood up slowly, my body stiff from weeks of sleeping on a narrow cot. Jerry looked between us, sensing the tension, and quietly excused himself. "Sarah." I wasn't sure what else to say. Part of me was relieved to see her, but a larger part was terrified that she'd come to deliver another devastating blow. She took a step closer, and I could see that she'd been crying. Her makeup was smeared slightly around her eyes, and her hair wasn't as perfectly styled as usual. "Can we talk, please?" I glanced around the common area, aware that several of the other men were watching us with curiosity. "There's a small patio out back. We could sit there." I led her through the shelter to the outdoor area, a concrete patio with a few plastic chairs and a view of the dumpsters behind the building. It wasn't much, but it was private. Sarah sat down heavily in one of the chairs, her purse clutched tightly in her lap. "Dad, I need to tell you something, and I don't know how to start." I remained standing, my arms crossed. After what she'd put me through, I wasn't ready to make this easy for her. "Mom's alive," she said finally, the words coming out in a rush. I stared at her, certain I'd misheard. "What did you say?" "She's alive. She faked her death. The whole funeral, the burial, everything. It was fake." Sarah's voice was shaking. "She did it to test me, to see if I would choose her over you." I felt my legs go weak, and I sank into the chair across from her. "That's impossible. I wish it were." Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, scrolling through photos until she found what she was looking for. She handed it to me, and I found myself staring at a picture of Margaret, very much alive, sitting on our living room sofa. "I took this 2 days ago," Sarah said quietly. "She's been staying in the house, waiting for me to come home." I handed the phone back, my mind reeling. Why would she do something so cruel? Sarah's face crumpled, and she began to cry in earnest. "Because she wanted to see if I would throw you out. She wanted to test whether I would choose loyalty to her over love for you. And you did." "Yes," Sarah whispered. "I did exactly what she wanted me to do. I said terrible things to you, Dad, things I can never take back. And I did it because she spent my entire life teaching me to see you as weak and disappointing." I felt a familiar ache in my chest, the same one I'd carried for 30 years of marriage. "What exactly did she tell you about me?" Sarah wiped her eyes with a tissue, smearing her mascara further. "She told me you were lazy, that you never tried hard enough to provide for us. She told me you were selfish, that you only cared about your own comfort. She told me you were weak, that you never fought for anything that mattered." Each word was like a physical blow. "And you believed her?" "I believed her because it's all I ever heard," Sarah said desperately. "Every time you made a mistake, she made sure I saw it as proof of your fundamental inadequacy. Every time she was disappointed, she made sure I understood it was because you weren't good enough." I stood up and walked to the edge of the patio, staring out at the parking lot beyond the fence. She was my wife for 30 years. If she thought I was such a failure, why did she stay? "Because she wanted to punish you," Sarah said quietly, "and because she wanted to make sure I never made what she saw as the same mistake, loving someone who couldn't give her the life she thought she deserved." I turned back to face her. What kind of life did she think she deserved? Something bigger, something more prestigious. We used to talk about the women from her college who married doctors and lawyers, who had big houses and expensive cars and trips to Europe. Sarah's voice was hollow. She'd never got over the fact that she married a construction worker instead of someone who could give her those things. "I worked hard," I said, and I hated how defensive I sounded. "I provided for both of you. Maybe we didn't have a mansion, but we had a good life." "I know that now," Sarah said, fresh tears streaming down her face. But she made sure I only saw what was missing, never what was there. Why are you telling me this now? What changed? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. She told me that everything she did was to protect me from making her mistakes. But when I asked her what mistakes those were, she said the mistake was loving someone who wasn't perfect. I felt something cold settle in my chest. And what did you say to that? I told her that loving someone shouldn't require them to be perfect, and she looked at me like I was the most naive person she'd ever met. Sarah looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. That's when I realized that she didn't just think you were weak, Dad. She thought love itself was weak. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 30 years of manipulation settling between us like a physical presence. I'm sorry, Sarah said finally. I know that's not enough, and I know I can't undo what I said to you at the funeral, but I'm so sorry. I studied her face, looking for signs of the calculated cruelty I'd seen there 3 weeks ago. Instead, I saw genuine remorse, and underneath that, something that looked like the daughter I'd once known. Where is she now? I asked. At the house. She's acting like everything is normal, like faking her death and manipulating both of us as just another Tuesday. Sarah's voice turned bitter. She asked me this morning if I'd learned my lesson about the importance of choosing wisely. What did you tell her? I told her I had learned something, but probably not what she intended. Sarah stood up and faced me directly. Dad, I want to make this right. I want to try to repair what I broke between us. I felt a war raging inside me. Part of me wanted to embrace my daughter, to tell her that everything was forgiven and we could start over. But another part of me, the part that had been crushed by her words at the funeral, wasn't ready to trust again. Sarah, I appreciate you coming here, and I'm grateful that you finally see what your mother really is. But I need you to understand something. I took a deep breath. For 35 years, I tried to be the father you needed. I may not have been perfect, but I loved you with everything I had. And in one afternoon, you threw all of that away because your mother told you to. Sarah flinched as if I'd slapped her. I need to know, I continued, that if I let you back into my life, you won't do that to me again. I need to know that you're strong enough to see me for who I really am, not who your mother convinced you I was. I am, Sarah said immediately. Dad, I swear to you, I see clearly now. I see how she manipulated both of us, how she used me as a weapon against you. It's going to take time, I said. Trust, once broken, doesn't just magically repair itself because someone apologizes. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face again. I know, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I want my father back. I looked at this woman, who was my daughter, who had been programmed from birth to see me as inadequate, and I made a decision that surprised even me. I want my daughter back too, I said quietly, but we're going to have to start from scratch. We're going to have to learn who we really are without your mother's voice in our heads. Sarah smiled for the first time since she'd arrived, and for just a moment I could see the little girl who used to help me build birdhouses in the garage. What about Mom? She asked. I thought about Margaret sitting in the house I'd helped pay for, orchestrating the destruction of her own family from beyond the supposed grave. Your mother made her choice a long time ago, I said. She chose bitterness over love, control over connection. Now she gets to live with the consequences of that choice. Sarah wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. She's not going to like losing control of both of us. No, I agreed, she's not. But that's her problem now, not ours. 6 months later, I was sitting in my small but comfortable apartment, reading the Sunday paper and drinking coffee from a mug Sarah had given me for my 65th birthday. The mug said, "World's Greatest Dad," simple words that meant more to me than any expensive gift ever could, because they came from a daughter who finally saw me clearly. The apartment wasn't much, a one-bedroom place above a bakery in a quiet neighborhood, but it was mine. Sarah had helped me find it and put down the deposit, but I paid the rent with my Social Security and the part-time job I'd found doing maintenance work for the apartment complex. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and for the first time in decades, I wasn't apologizing for who I was or what I could provide. Sarah came by every Sunday for coffee and conversation. It had taken months to rebuild any semblance of a father-daughter relationship. And there were still moments when I could see Margaret's training surface in her reactions. But Sarah was trying, genuinely trying, to see past the programming she'd received her entire life. "How are you feeling about everything?" she'd asked me just the week before, settling into the secondhand armchair I'd bought at a thrift store. "Free," I'd answered, and it was the truth. "For the first time since I was 34 years old, I feel free." Sarah had smiled, but there was sadness in it. "I'm sorry it took so long." "Don't apologize for your mother's choices," I'd told her, "and don't apologize for being manipulated by someone who spent your entire childhood programming you. You were a victim too, Sarah. The difference is, you found the courage to break free." We'd talked about Margaret, of course. How could we not? She was the ghost that haunted both of our recoveries, the toxic influence we were both learning to resist. After Sarah had found me at the shelter, she'd gone home to confront her mother one final time. The conversation, as Sarah had described it to me, had been everything I'd expected, and worse. "I told her I was going to help you get back on your feet," Sarah had said, and Mom looked at me like I'd announced I was joining a cult. What did she say? She said I was throwing away everything she'd taught me, that I was choosing weakness over strength. Sarah had paused, her jaw tightening. Then she said that if I was determined to make the same mistakes she did, she couldn't stop me, but she wouldn't enable it. Enable what? "My self-destructive tendency to coddle failures," Sarah had quoted, shaking her head. She made it sound like helping my own father was some kind of character flaw. Margaret had tried everything to regain control: guilt, manipulation, threats, and finally, when nothing else worked, complete emotional withdrawal. She'd packed her things and left the house, telling Sarah she was disappointed beyond words in her daughter's choices. "Where did she go?" I'd asked. "I don't know and I don't care," Sarah had replied, and I'd been proud of the strength in her voice. She told me she was going to stay with her sister in Phoenix until I came to my senses. That had been 4 months ago. Sarah had received exactly 3 phone calls from Margaret since then, each one a test to see if Sarah had changed her mind, if she was ready to abandon me again and return to the fold. Each time, Sarah had politely but firmly declined to engage. The house, our old house, Sarah had decided to sell. "Too many bad memories," she'd said. "I want to start fresh somewhere that doesn't have Mom's manipulations built into the walls." She'd bought a small townhouse across town and started seeing a therapist who specialized in family trauma. "I'm learning to recognize when I'm reacting to Mom's programming versus my own actual feelings," she'd told me. "It's harder than I expected." I'd started seeing someone too, not a therapist, but Dr. Patricia Reeves, a widow I'd met at the community center where I'd started volunteering. Patricia was 62, a retired elementary school teacher with silver hair and laugh lines around her eyes. She'd lost her husband to cancer 3 years ago and understood what it meant to rebuild your life after loss. "You seem different," she'd told me, after we'd been seeing each other for a month. "More solid, like you know who you are." "I'm learning," I'd said. "For 30 years, I let someone else define me. I'm finally figuring out what I think of myself." Patricia had smiled. "And what do you think?" I'd considered the question seriously. "I think I'm a decent man who worked hard and loved his family. I think I made mistakes, but I never stopped trying. I think I'm worthy of respect and love, even if I'm not perfect." "That sounds like a man I'd like to know better," she'd said, and I'd felt something I hadn't experienced in decades, the simple pleasure of being appreciated for who I actually was. The contrast between Patricia and Margaret was startling. Where Margaret had always found fault, Patricia found things to appreciate. Where Margaret had demanded change, Patricia accepted me as I was, while encouraging me to grow. Where Margaret had used love as a weapon, Patricia offered it as a gift with no strings attached. "She sounds wonderful," Sarah had said when I'd told her about Patricia. "I'd like to meet her sometime." "She'd like that too," I'd said. "She thinks it's important for me to rebuild my relationship with you, even though I was horrible to you." Patricia says everyone deserves the chance to grow and change, as long as they're genuinely committed to it. I'd looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and seen the woman she was becoming as she freed herself from her mother's influence. And you are committed to changing, aren't you? Every day, Sarah had said firmly, every day I work to be better than Mom taught me to be. Now, sitting in my apartment on this quiet Sunday morning, I reflected on how much had changed. Margaret had intended to test our loyalty, to see if we would choose her version of strength over what she saw as weakness. But her test had revealed something she never expected, that her version of strength was actually cruelty, and that real strength lay in the ability to love imperfect people anyway. Sarah knocked on my door at exactly 10 a.m. just like she did every Sunday. But today was different. Today, Patricia was with her, carrying a box of pastries from the bakery downstairs. "I hope you don't mind," Sarah said, smiling genuinely for perhaps the first time in my presence. "I thought it was time you two officially met." As I watched my daughter and the woman I was growing to love set up coffee and pastries in my small kitchen, chatting easily about everything and nothing, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 30 years, contentment. Not the desperate gratitude of someone who'd been thrown scraps of affection, but the deep satisfaction of someone who was finally, truly valued. My phone buzzed once, a text from an unknown number. I glanced at it and saw Margaret's name. The message was short. "I hope you're both happy with your choices." I read it, deleted it, and blocked the number. Margaret's opinion of my choices was no longer relevant to my life. Sarah noticed me with the phone. "Everything okay, Dad?" "Everything's perfect," I said, and meant it completely. Outside, the spring morning was bright and full of possibility. Inside, surrounded by people who loved me not despite my flaws, but including them, I finally understood what happiness actually felt like. It didn't require perfection or prestige or the approval of someone who was incapable of genuine love. It just required the courage to accept that I was enough, exactly as I was. Margaret had spent 30 years trying to convince both Sarah and me that love had to be earned through constant improvement, constant striving to be worthy of it. But love, real love, didn't work that way. Real love was what Patricia offered me when she took my work-roughened hand in hers and said it felt perfect. Real love was what Sarah gave me when she looked past 35 years of programming and chose to see her father with new eyes. As for Margaret, wherever she was learning the hardest lesson of all, that a life built on control and manipulation eventually leaves you with no one left to control, and no one willing to be manipulated. I raised my coffee mug in a silent toast to my new life, and to the family I'd found in the rubble of the one that had been destroyed. Sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the ugliest packages, and sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover what really matters. At 65, I was finally free to be exactly who I'd always been, a decent man who deserved to be loved.